questions. I'm going to start with Philip, because Philip and I have had an ongoing conversation about these issues.
I apologize in jumping in and trying to make the broader point all at once, but I have to go teach.
Yeah.
And so, especially while Facebook Live is still there.
Actually, I think just
Darn it! All right, I have nothing to say.
Well, we've got it back here, actually.
there you go. Yeah, you're on. Yeah.
But I just wonder if I could present the other view with the goal of saying that here are two views that can be more in dialogue, and that there isn't a sort of final refutation. So do you mind if you go back to the first critiques of ex nihilo?
Yeah.
And I want to be, what I love about this book, I actually brought a bunch of your books, but Theologies of Creation, is that when you
Philip's
write
got a great essay in that book, by the way.
when you write your final essay, you're not critiquing anyone. You're presenting your own view, like you did today.
That's right.
Well, a little bit less today. And I think that that's compelling.
So keep going.
Speaking of that, all the way back to where you actually began.
Problems.
Yeah, that no, before the very beginning, not the other. Before there is, there we go, that's the one. All right. Isn't it? That's the beginning.
Well, it's, yeah, when I start talking about problems, yeah.
Okay. Love is a relation. Creatio ex nihilo implies that God's initial creating was non-relational. The position that, and these are developments since we did the book, the position that I affirm is that God was always relational in and of God's self.
In Trinity.
So John has called that Binitarianism. There are a variety of kinds of Trinitarianism which aren't necessarily creedal. German idealism, so forth. But I believe that there is inherent relationality within God. The goal of creation, God's will in creation, is to deepen relationality by those who are outside the eternal divine nature and who are freely involved in this relationship. I'll say more about that in a second.
That's
too.
similar to the view of Clark Pinnock. He used a nice analogy of marriage. He says, you know, when a couple gets married, they have the relational love there, and they decide to have a child. So that's kind of like sort of the Trinity. We have relationality, and it decides to create a world.
Yeah, that's helpful, but I would want to strengthen it.
Okay.
I would want to say that there is something that God wants to know as a loving being, so we share that in common.
Right.
That God can only know through a free relationship with something outside God's self. That God's not compelled to do that any more than the couple is compelled to have children. But that becomes, so it's a canonic doctrine of creation. Interestingly, we both use that same phrase.
Different ways.
But I really resist the necessity.
Right.
So we can't do it today, but I think there's a clash between love and necessity. We've done that one before, too. While love comes before sovereign choice in God, Creatio ex nihilo suggests that God could have chosen not to lovingly create. And I think that's true. God is not compelled to create.
Right. You have to differ on that.
Right, but that there's a motivation in God, which the will to love and be loved, the will to change and be changed, is a part. I actually, the capital C. Well, let's move on from that one. Number 3, I think, was the last one. Right, because there was there a 4 of it?
You probably don't have a problem with that one.
No, not at all. No, in fact, it's the opposite. Right. Link the doctrine of God.
This is the problem with evil one that I put in there. What do you think about this one?
So I think that the creation ex amore, creation out of the unfolding, eternal, fundamental love of God, is the desire to be in a creation which is never automata, but is always beings, and that God's process of discovery is much more radical than tradition has said. And there's where, after the moment of creation, I think you and I walk in lockstep.
Yeah,
We're
so
very similar.
just real quick, so what Philip is saying is he's saying God didn't have to create. My position is saying God did have to create. And he's saying, you know, Tom's position, God's like, you know, like on autopilot. God has to, and that doesn't sound very
No,
free.
that's a straw man, because you
Oh, it is?
beautifully spell out in this talk.
Okay.
So I want people to
I wasn't
feel
trying to make a straw man. I was trying to
no,
be
of your own
faithful.
position. So I think
Oh.
you give a compelling account. I think it's powerful. We need to be engaged in dialogue with it. I want to show that the ex nihilo position is compelling as well. What if God's relationship with the created world is far more radically contingent than even the non-Nicetarians or the most orthodox or most of the ex nihilo thinkers have thought. So what if, for example, God doesn't know what's good for the creation? God doesn't know in advance what's moral for the creation. God's eternal being is love, but I didn't know what love meant in marriage till I was married or as a father. I just had, TV shows or other people's examples.
Yeah.
So what if there's a kind of, I call it progressive moral realism, so that God is actually learning, for example, that slavery is wrong as things go. And once God learns that, that becomes an enduring truth, because God recognizes.
I could meet you halfway on that. I would say that God always wants to promote well-being, and that's eternally true. But how that gets expressed in ongoing history, God might learn new ways along the process.
Okay, we're close.
We're not in the same place.
So I'm going to be more radical, which is interesting because the creativity or contingency is higher on this view.
You're right.
Which surprises me that you said that. All right, now let's talk about a progressive understanding of what it is to fuse with created beings. And that God does not know that in advance. There is no recipe, but what it means to be with a creation that's evolving freely, God evolving freely, and an emerging relationship God couldn't have known in advance out of the nature of love as such. And then you see where that's pointing.
Yeah.
Closer and closer relationship as creation freely evolves more and more complex. Deeper senses of unity across spiritual traditions and spiritual individuals until, and here's my Christological side, there's a complete fusion where God learns and participates, where Jesus learns and participates. That's a faith statement from my side.
Again, I think
into
we
a kind
have
of union, which
similarities
then
and
through the Spirit becomes available to all future beings.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a whole logic of ex nihilo, as you see. Just as yours is beautifully consistent out of the, I'll call it necessary framework. So I want to make sure I got that on the table. I'm going to shut up now, but it's interesting to see what a rich, and I want to say almost eternal dialogue there is between those two.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Philip's work has been really helpful to me. Again, as you can see, we have differences of views on things, but good dialogue partners make your own point. You see the weaknesses, and you try to shore up those with other arguments and try to make strength. So thanks so much for adding that, Philip. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
I find it very difficult to disagree with you on
Good.
anything.
Philip, over here.
Except.
Oh, no. That's usually the way that sentence starts.
Title.
The title. Okay, you don't like initial.
New.
Oh, you don't think my idea is new?
My question, no. I believe you before I came here. My question is, how would you distinguish your position essentially from Charles Hartshorne?
Essentially would be the key word in that question. I'm not the first to think that God, that there was universe before our universe. The kind of formulation I'm putting on the table, I don't know of anyone who says it quite like that. I don't know of anyone who said, look, love is X, love logically comes first in God, therefore we should think about creation differently. But there are lots of people, and John Cobb would be one in this room, who've talked about denying creation out of nothing and other ways to think about that.
Well, history goes on, and you have clarified what this means very well.
Thank you.
But sitting in Charles Hartshorne's classes, I think I hear an echo.
Well, one of the things
He did say love was essential to doctrine.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if he did. I don't know if he made the connection with creating life I have, but maybe.
He wasn't a biblical theologian. He wasn't so fascinated with the issue of creation as such.
Probably the other thing, too, that makes my presentation sound like Charles Hartshorne is he was more into analytic philosophy.
Yes.
And this, I've decided today to try to go that route, so, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to mention something about the, one of your main arguments seems to be the creation out of something versus out of nothing, right? Now, I don't know how deeply you studied the particle physics. I think that this argument seems to be caused by the, say, lack of knowledge in particle physics. In particle physics, when you say something versus nothing, something means some tangible, physical object versus nothing means invisible, nothing, you don't feel anything, right? Now, in particle physics, I mean, the modern particle physics get to the point that this tangible something, when you get down to the particle physics and all get down to the ultimate substances, there's no border or boundary between something versus nothing. In that case, I think that argument just goes away.
Okay. Well, I do read in physics, but I definitely am not an expert. It sounds like you might know more than I do. One of the things that I sometimes will do, and I didn't in this presentation, is make a distinction between nothing and absolutely nothing. So some people will say, well, nothing is a something. It's just a disordered something, or you can't see it. And I've just decided to kind of eliminate that and just say, when I say nothing, I mean absolutely nothing. So if particle physics says there's no distinction between something and absolutely nothing, then I think I probably would have a problem. But if it's a distinction between something and nothing that's not quite absolutely nothing, but the possibility, then maybe I'm not so.
Well, the presence of God is itself, there's energy,
Yeah.
sort of, right? So we cannot imagine that absolutely nothing shouldn't exist. I mean,
Yeah.
energy is something, space is something. There's always something. Absolutely nothing doesn't really
Make sense.
mean anything. That doesn't make sense.
You and I totally agree on that. Yep. Good. Yes.
First thing is, I'm glad to see that a codependent God has left the room. That's a good thing. But I'm a little stuck here because I don't see any. It seems a little static to me.
Okay.
Where is, like for what Philip was talking about? Where's the evolution? Where's the movement?
Yeah.
Is there any kind
Yeah.
of forward motion
So
here?
this didn't emphasize it. That's a fair criticism. I do believe in process. I do believe in evolution and movement. And so I guess maybe like the only way I touched on it here was talking about in every moment God creates something new out of previous. So that's your dynamism. That's your movement, your process. I could have done a different lecture and emphasized that, but I think one of the things is that that word perfect for a lot of people sounds very static. And one of the things Charles Hartshorne, I think, taught many of us is that perfect can have both a static sense but also a movement sense, a processualist. And I affirm perfection in both of those senses.
But if there's no beginning, then my little blue collar linear mind is going, well, then how does this thing move? Where does it go?
Yeah, so I guess fundamentally I'm saying there's no beginning, it's always been going. So I'm taking movement even more radically than maybe you initially thought, that there's always been moving, there's always been process, there's always been time. And so, kind of a classical theologian would say God is essentially timeless, and then maybe created time when God created the universe. I'm very much of a process person by saying that God is time-full, and the creation is time-full. And then I'm adding on to that, and there was no beginning of this timefulness. It's just always ongoing.
Does it have any directional element?
It does, but not a directional element in the sense that it's already been predetermined where it will end up. The directionality comes from a God of love who is guiding it toward well-being, beauty, etc. Good stuff. Yeah,
You mentioned Jesus one time only, and
oh, man.
and
I'm going to take away my evangelical credentials.
you dragged in kenosis. And,
He's the master.
I'm all in favor of mentioning Jesus. I don't think you need kenosis. I think Jesus reveals God, whether or not we have the doctrine of kenosis in there.
Okay.
I think-
I like that too, but what about kenosis worries you?
Hmm?
What about kenosis kind of worries you?
Well, I think that there are different positions, different Christologies, and that,
Sure.
and that if you take that out, then other people could add whichever other Christology applies a little bit better for them, and it's more in congruence with their own perspectives and with yours. I didn't see a necessity of introducing kenosis there in order for Jesus to fit into your.
That's fair, yeah. I'm using kenosis as sort of a way in that some people know. I've also noticed, Ignacio, and this may or may not apply to your thinking, I've noticed that scholars who are a little older, when they hear kenosis, they oftentimes jump to the debates of kenosis Christologies and whether or not Jesus, gave up certain divine attributes. I'm actually not appealing to that debate when I use that word kenosis. I'm appealing to a particular way of thinking about God's power, so that some contemporary theologians, in fact, Philip might be one of these, who says that God voluntarily gives up power, and my essential kenosis is saying no, God necessarily does so. Philip is rare amongst those who say that God necessarily gives up power by saying that after God gives up power in the creation of the universe, God never intervenes or takes it over again. It is not only once view. Many other kenosis theologians want to say God maybe periodically will.
Yeah, I think if you want to make sure that people understand if that's where you want to go, then you don't want to refer necessarily to the Philippians text, which is the one that has showed that perspective of the older kenosis.
Very true. I say that because a biblical scholar at Seattle Pacific University last week said almost the same thing you said, and when I teased him out, and it was because he was thinking about those controversies in Christology.
Well, is the Philippians text not more referring to the Christ as opposed to Jesus?
Well, it all depends on how you interpret it. What my proposal, and actually I'm not new in proposing this, is that Jesus tells us something about God's nature. And then I take the one additional step and say, and this self-giving, others empowering love is essential to who God is, and God can't not give this love. That's what makes me a little bit different from some of the other kenosis theologians.
Yes, I'd like to ask you to share your perspective on what it means to tell a 14-year-old child that pregnancy either happens or doesn't happen, and that puts him or her into a situation of having to make a decision about which you're declaring ignorance.
About which I'm declaring ignorance, or
Well,
person?
in your understanding of the process of impregnation. I mean,
Yeah.
one is either pregnant or not pregnant.
Yes, I'm with you there. So the proposal, I'm having 3 daughters. I know about this. Process doesn't say that there's no beginning to any creature. All creatures have a beginning. So all pregnancy speaks about the beginning, conception, however you think about that. What I'm only proposing is that God didn't have a beginning. And in that particular view, I'm not particularly unorthodox. I mean, most theologians think that. So I'm saying that this particular universe even, I believe in the Big Bang. I think there's lots of good evidence to say the universe is expanding 13.8 billion years ago, roughly so. All I'm proposing is that maybe we ought to think about something that existed prior to the Big Bang of this universe, and that the whole creative process that God has been going, that 100,000-year-old John Cobb had no beginning or end. So creaturely existence always has beginnings. Any particular creature universe, God is beginningless.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for putting the emphasis on love.
Thanks.
And so I'm not a scholar. I'm a student who is very ignorant and just on the beginning part of understanding process theology in that sense. But I do have a question that keeps on coming up into my head in terms of when we talk about love and we talk about controlling. Personally, and I'm kind of loading the question by saying this, I'm very happy that my mother and father loved me enough to be controlling over me at a certain point. So in your view, are love and controlling mutually exclusive?
Yeah, good question. So I threw in a little bit of philosophical language here when I said a priori or a posteriori, believe that God's love is uncontrolled. When I'm using this word control, I'm using it in a philosophical way. That is, I'm saying acting like a sufficient cause, or to say it more colloquially, totally control. So I'm making the claim that love never totally controls another. Now, I do think love can strongly influence, and we who have bodies can use our bodies in ways that involve bodily impact in the name of love to try to prevent horrific events. But I'm making the claim that love never acts as a sufficient cause. Now, one way to make that claim is the a priori claim, which is that, by definition, inherently, love is uncontrolling. And there's some theologians who do that. I actually find the a posteriori claim more powerful, at least when it comes to God's, saying God's love is uncontrolling. And my thinking is like this. If God has the power to control, in the sense of a sufficient cause, and God is a God of love, and God wants to prevent evil, which all those things seem to be right, then why doesn't God use that controlling power to prevent evil? So that's looking around the world and saying there's lots of evil. That's an a posteriori kind of move, saying there's lots of evil. Why is it here if God is like this? Well, if God is not like that, then we maybe have an explanation. Maybe God's love is uncontrolling, and that's why God doesn't prevent these kinds of evils. One other important distinction, and that is, and I kind of hinted at it just a moment ago when I talked about bodies. I believe a very standard Christian view, I think it's just also Jewish, probably Muslim as well, that God is a universal spirit without a localized divine physical body. So, the classic language in the tradition was God is incorporeal, incorporeal. Or the biblical writers talk about the pneuma, the spirit, or the ruach. God is described as a wind, or a breath, or a mind. One of my theological favorite theologians, John Wesley, called God the soul of the universe. That's a way of talking about somehow God is present to all creation as a spirit, but not as a localized physical body. And that's important because sometimes you and I use our bodies to grab kids out of the way of traffic and therefore rescue them in the name of love. And then we say, well, if we can do that, if we can grab kids out of traffic, then why can't God? Well, my answer is, God doesn't have a physical, localized body like we do. Now, God might call upon us to grab kids out of the way, but that's different than if God